Hey there everyone, Cynthia here, and I'm in my quilt lab today working on a scrappy version of month 4 of the Illusions Sampler Patent written by Scott Flanagan. You can see Banyan Batiks is doing a block of the month this year, 2022, and I'm working on month 4. Let's get going. Let me show you what I got here. Just as usual, I'm not talking about sizes or anything because I want to make sure that Scott's copyright stays true. So if you like the pattern, make sure to watch for it when it gets released for the general public. Month 4, we have the background 1. I got some big squares and a bunch of small squares. We're going to be doing a tiny itty bitty baby 9 patch. And I also had fabrics 1, 2, 4, and 7. Also with the big squares and a bunch of little squares as well. So let's get started and get to piecing the main block of the month 4 sampler. Grab all of your little small squares and let's get going. All right, there's our small squares, itty bitty tiny little babies, and we're going to be making a 9 patch. So there's 5 of each of the colors. And you want 4 of the background. So I'm just going to do the yellow real quick and give you an idea of what it looks like. One, 2, 3, and 4. So there's that pretty little 9 patch. You can see it's going to be a small block. So cute. And just like we did with the bigger 9 block in a couple of months back, we're going to be piecing together in the rows and then piecing the rows together to make the block. Just a couple things to point out real quick. When we're pressing these seams, we're going to be pressing towards the darker fabric, which is always going to be the 4 different colors, whether it's yellow, orange, green, or blue. And I'm going to go to the sewing machine, put this one together, see what it looks like, and I'll be right back. All right, so I'm back and I've done the 3 rows. I'll flip them over so you can see that I did press towards the dark side, which is going to be the colored pieces as opposed to the background pieces. And the reason we do that is because they're going to nest just perfect when we flip them together. I love that Scott is very thoughtful about his pressing. So they nest up really well. Open that up so you can see how well that nests. And what I like to do is take a little pin, stick it right through that seam, and it'll come out the exact same spot on the other side. We'll do that with the other side, and then we'll be able to take this to the machine and do the stitch. So do that to both of them so that you get your square. The end product will look like this. There we go. When you want to press it, you want to press it to the outside. So let me flip it over so you can see. So we pressed the top one to the top and the bottom one to the bottom. So that's ready to go. Do that with all 4 of them, and then the 9 patches will be done. I do want to make a side note. These are really small pieces, so please make sure you're using an accurate 1/4 inch seam. This is going to be crucial. So, because if it's off even by just a little, they're not going to measure the size they need to be. So if you need to take a moment to test out your 1/4 inch seam, be sure to do that before you start piecing any of those. And I'll link my little 1/4 inch seam video in the notes below as a little supplement video. Once these are done, we're going to set them aside and we're going to move on to the next step. Okay, so the next step brings us back to a very familiar component, the half square triangle. And just like before, we're going to take some of those background pieces, 4 of them, and 1 of each of the 4 colors. I'll set the rest of these aside. And what we're going to do is we're going to draw a line right down the middle of that background piece. Do that with all 4 of the background pieces, and then you're going to pair each of them up with 1 of the colored squares. stitch along that center line, and then we'll come back and chop off the rest that we don't need, press it open so that we have our pretty half square triangles. Let me go do that and I'll be right back. All right, so I did that seam right down the center. And what I want to do now is trim off the extra. So I'm taking my ruler and I'm putting the 1/4 inch marks right on top of that seam so we can trim the rest off. Then we're going to take this to the iron and press it open towards that the colored fabric as opposed to that background fabric. So I'll just do a little quick finger press here, give you the idea. And then do that 3 more times with the other 3 colors and your half square triangles are done. So now we need to gather all the rest of the squares plus those 9 patches, and we'll talk about putting it together to make our main block. Let's gather our pieces. All right, so gather all your squares. You'll have your 4 9 patches, your 4 half square triangles. Then you also have the other 4 full squares of colors and the last 4 background squares as well. So follow the pattern as far as layout is concerned, and then we'll talk about stitching and pressing. So let me do a quick layout here. Okay, so that's what the layout looks like in the book. Kind of see a little bit of a pattern as far as what's across from each other, which is kind of cool. So they're going to have you, the instructions are going to have you piece each row. The first row and the second row, after you've pieced them, you're going to press towards the left, and that second row and 4th row, after you've pieced these seams together, are going to be pressed towards the right. So let's do that real quick, and then I'll come back and we'll talk about putting the rows together. Okay, so there are the 4 rows. You can see that, flip them over so you can see the pressing to the left, right, right. That way, when we go to nest them up to each other, all of them will nest really nicely. So that's what we're going to do next. We're going to put the rows together, and then when they're all seamed together, we're going to press all the seams up towards the top of that block. So let's do that, and I'll be right back. Okay, so there's the finished block. Everything is pieced together, and just like before, I would put pins in where all the corners hit so that I make sure they hit pretty nicely. This is off just a smidgen, but I'm not too upset with that. I do want to point out that it is really bulky right here because all of the seams have been pressed up. I'll turn it over. So I may go back and actually press this seam open so it balances out that bulkiness there in the center. But otherwise, it's pretty good. Give it a little best press or starch and set this guy aside, and we'll move on to some accent strips. All right, so let's talk accent strips and all the fabric that comes with it. The instructions include some background 1 squares and some background 3 rectangles. And then there's 2 sets of squares from the different colors of fabric. The first set is fabric 1, 3, 6, 7, and 9, and those are going to go with the background 1s because we're going to be making some Drunkard's path again. And then the second set, 1, 2, 3, 5, 7, and 8, is going to be a new step. We're going to do some paper piecing with some triangles. So really looking forward to that. Let's start with some Drunkard's path and let me get things organized. Okay, so the first half of the accent strips is a drunkard's path, and we did the drunkard's path back in month 3, but let me just review everything because you'll want to go back to that month 3 instructions for the template, whether you use the applique version, which is what the instructions originally include, or if you want to do a piece version, which is the extra piece. It's up to you which way you want to go. The applique goes by super fast, so that's what I'm going to do today. But let me just cover both real quick, and in the comments below, I'll put a little video about the piecing of a drunkard's path. So with the month 3 instructions, you had 2 templates. One template that was for the applique, and then the secondary one is the piecing. You'll see the 2 pieces, the concave and the convex. So with the piecing, if you're going to go that way, you're going to take your piecing out of your convex out of your background, and then your concave out of those 5 different color pieces. That's the way that you do the piecing, and check out that other video. For the applique, you're going to need some fusible facing, and you're going to make this template on that facing 5 times, or put the template or put the fusible on the back side of each of your pieces, put your template on top, and then cut out what you need, because it's going to make that concave version. So what I'm going to do is, because I only have a little bit of this sheet left, is I'm going to trace this template onto my sheets of fusible web, and I'm using Steam Lite too because it's my favorite. I need 5 of these, and then I'm going to transfer them to the back side of these 5 pieces, trim them down, and then we applique them on to those backgrounds. And if you go back to my month 3 video, you'll see me go into this process a little bit more in depth. But because I've already done this once before, I'm just going to speed through the applique version right now, and then we'll move on. Let's get going. All right, once you got the fusible and all trimmed down to that drunkard's path, you can peel off the other side and attach it to one of the background pieces. And like I said before, I'm using Steam 2 Lite, and the reason I like it is because it's a little tacky, but not so sticky that once I put it down, I can't remove it. So if I wanted to, I can absolutely peel this back off and put it back down so that it's a little straighter. So I'm going to do that with all of these. Then I'm going to take it back to the iron and give it a press so that it is permanently adhered and appliqued on. And then just like before, we're going to be doing another little applique stitch around that curved part. And I'm probably going to pick a background color and do a blanket stitch. So let me do all that, and I'll be right back. All right, so here's the 5 drunkard's path. They're all stitched down with a pretty little applique stitch, little blanket stitch. It has you leave the purpley violet one separate because that's going to be one of the little bottom pieces, and then we're going to piece the other 4 together. And because this is my quilt, I'm going to kind of mix up the order. It has blue, green, yellow, red, and I'm actually going to switch a couple of them, only because I don't like having just the plain solid fabrics next to each other. It's just a personal choice. Of course, I'm not breaking any rules. This is your quilt. You can put the colors in whatever order you want to. There's no requirement. No quilt police here. So after I stitch them together to make this one strip, I'm going to press towards the right. So let me do that real quick. We'll come back, check in, and then we'll move on to the next accent strip. Okay, so the second accent strip is a paper piecing exercise making a triangle square. In the instructions comes the template for the paper piecing. It says to make a few copies so that we can make all 6 of them. You can use any of those paper piecing papers. Carol Doak is a fantastic product. You can use newspaper print, or you can just use plain office paper. What I tend to do is I tend to keep the paper that I've used once before, and I use the flip side for my paper piecing templates. That way I kind of recycle and reuse a piece of paper and still able to get my quilting done. So you'll need 6 of the paper piecing papers. You'll need your 6 fabric squares, and you'll need your background 3 rectangles. I also recommend having some pins available. A great recommendation is having an add a quarter ruler. Not necessary, but let me tell you, this is a great product, and I'll show you it in action in just a couple minutes. And this isn't in the instructions, but I like to use a little dab of fabric glue to help hold things in place. So let's get started with these instructions. Okay, so the instructions say to follow just a general paper piecing practice. And if you have a paper piecing practice, say that 5 times fast, already in your back pocket that you want to use, feel free. I'm just going to do a quick version here, and maybe I'll attach another video in the comments about some other tips and tricks when paper piecing. So what you're going to do is you're going to cut out your piece, your paper piece, and you're going to have the square of fabric, and you're going to see, I'm going to put fabric down. The nice thing about our cutting instructions is that the piece of fabrics are much bigger than what you need, which is really nice, especially for anybody who's a beginner with paper piecing. It's nice to have a little bit bigger. When you're cutting a piece, just for future reference, anytime you want to cut a piece for paper piecing, it needs to be 1/4 of an inch bigger all the way around. So 1/4 of an inch out from each of the corners, from the bottom, and from that tip. That's why this square is as big as it is. In fact, the instructions look like it's closer to 3/8, which is what I recommend. I recommend having it 3/8 bigger on each side. So it's going to have you take the piece of paper, and I want you to fold the piece of paper between the piece 1 and piece number 2. Now that's the piece 1, that's our main fabric, and the piece 2 and 3 is our background fabric. And what I like to do, because it's easier to see, is I like to fold it both ways. That way I can see that line. And then I fold it back this way. So that's what they want you to do. That way when you place this on top of the upside down piece of fabric, you know how much of that fabric you're going to use. And then you're going to cut off all this extra stuff. This is where that ruler comes in real handy. Now, I'm not sure if you can see on the camera, maybe here in the light, there's a little lip on the back side of the add a quarter ruler, and it's nice because it'll butt right up against that piece of paper as a little ledge, so that way you can cut it all off, and that's 1/4 of an inch, so it's perfect. So I'm just going to slice off the rest of this fabric, take that away, and I can take the ruler away. And before I take my finger up off of this, I'm going to take my little glue, and I'm just going to put a little dab of glue. Now, of course, this will wash out at some point when you wash your top, but it's nice to have a little piece of little extra adherence there. Okay, so the next thing is I've opened this up a piece of paper. I'm going to flip this over very carefully. That's why I like that glue there. And I'm going to take one of the background rectangles, and I'm going to put it right up against that cut that we just did, right there. Now I'm going to take a pin, and I'm going to pin these two together. I'm going to go through all 3 pieces, the 2 pieces of fabric and the 1 piece of paper. And you'll notice when I flip this back over and fold that back, that's 1/4 of an inch. So now when you take it to your sewing machine, you're going to actually sew all the way through right on top of that line. So I'm going to stitch, and I'm even going to stitch all the way past the edge. So this edge right here, that's going to be the edge of your square. So I'm going to stitch all the way across that entire piece. Now I'm going to, just a couple other tips, I'm going to shorten the stitch length. somewhere around 16 inches per inch, or something like a 2.0 or smaller. The reason is that it's going to make more holes through that paper, and eventually we're going to rip that paper off. So the more perforations we have, the easier it is to take that paper off in the future. So let's go do that stitch, and I'll be right back and show you what the next process is. So there you can see I've done that stitch all the way across. I can take the pin out, and I'm just going to do a quick finger press here so you can see what we're going to do. Give that a nice pressing. So let me just take this to the iron real quick. So I gave that a nice crisp press so you can see the one side of the triangle. Let's flip it back over. We're going to do the same thing over on the other side. So I'm going to bend back this line right here between piece 1 and 3, and like I said, I like to fold both ways just because it's easier for me to see. There's that one side. Now I can flip it back this way. And if I need to stitch through it, don't worry, just take those stitches out. Perfect. So now I can get my add a quarter and chop off the rest. Now when I did that first stitch, I went all the way through. You don't have to. You can just go up to the right to the edge. I like to go all the way through and just rip the stitches out if I need to, just as an extra security, because sometimes I manhandle my blocks and they start to fray. So I like to go all the way to the edge. That's just a personal thing. You'll find instruction out there in the world that says don't do that. Go right to the edge. Please do what works best for you. No quilt police here. So we'll flip this over. We'll grab our other background piece and do the exact same thing. We're going to line up the edges to that edge. I'm going to throw in a pin. Again, I'm going through all the pieces. So that way when I flip it back over, I'm going to now do this line right here. So let me take that to the sewing machine and I'll be right back. Okay, so there's that second stitch. I can take this pin out and press this open. Let me take this to the iron. All right, there we go. So it's pressed right open. So you can see the triangle that we've made right there. So the next step is you've got all of this down. You just need to trim off the extra. So just grab your regular ruler. And you'll notice that this edge, so there's the edge of the block, that's the 1/4 inch that we want to leave for the 1/4 inch seam. So you're going to cut at that seam right there. And I'm just using my regular ruler, but I'm making sure everything lines up both at the edge and at the 1/4 inch seam. And we'll do this to all 4 sides. So we've trimmed off all the extra. Let's turn it over. There's our pretty triangle block. And the next thing to do is just to remove the paper. I'm going to leave it on until I have all 6 of them done, and then I'll have a paper ripping party. So go ahead and do this with the other 5 blocks. And if you need to, rewind the video so that you can watch this again. Paper piecing does take a little bit of time to get used to. In fact, before I got started doing this one, I did a little practice round just to make sure I remember what to do. The funny thing about paper piecing is you're looking at it, the paper this way, but that's actually a mirror image of what you're going to see on the other side. And it isn't a big deal with this because it's symmetrical on both sides. Both halves are the same. But on something that you do in the future, just remember that your printing of your paper is going to be opposite from what it looks like when you're finished. So do a few more of these. When you're finished, we'll come back and we'll talk about putting them together for the second accent strip. All right, you can see here I have all the pieces finished, all the paper piecing. I just need to take the paper off of the back of it, and I just want to show you what I do when I take the paper off. Because you've used a smaller stitch width length, it's going to be easier because there's more perforation holes. If you want to, you can fold it back and skim it with your nail, which will help. If you have a stiletto, you can actually just go over the top of it, and I'm just pressing very lightly along the top of that seam. Just helps peel that paper back. You can see how easy that comes off. Pretty simple. Another tip, if you have a really hard time peeling this off, give it a little spritz with some water and let it slightly dry a little bit, because that'll help loosen up the fibers of the paper. But I find if you've done a nice close stitch and give it a press with your nail or run the stiletto against it, it peels off really nicely. Now, I do recommend giving paper piecing a try because I think it's a lot of fun and you get some really accurate seams. However, if you know that you hate paper piecing, you can always piece these by using one of the triangle templates. Scott recommends one in the book, and I'll put a link of that product in the comments below. But I am following along in what the original pattern does. It's nice though that he gives some different tips if one type of process isn't your cup of tea. So once you have all the paper peeled off and ready to go, all you got to do is lay these out in the order it talks about, and it has them in the order of blue, teal, purple, yellow, red, and orange. And you'll notice that they make a zigzag, so it points up, down, up, down, up, down. So we're going to seam all of these together next to make the last accent strip. Please pay close attention to those pressing instructions, because it's going to have you press everything toward the right, or to the right, except for that one there at the end. It's going to have you press towards the left, and that's because that's going to line up with the accent strip at the end when we put everything together. So let me piece all these together. I'll do the pressing, and then we'll come back and talk about putting the whole block together. I'll be right back. And there we go. That's the last accent strip. Let me just flip it over so you can see all the pressing. Everything goes to the right except for this last one. It goes to the left. And that's, of course, for when we put everything together. So let's put everything together. Grab all your pieces along with those block assembly cutting instruction pieces, and let's put block number 4 together. All right, here is all the pieces. Let's put it together, and this should look very familiar because we've done all this before. Got our big block here. We're going to put up in the corner. We got our Drunkard's Path accent strip. It's going to go over here to the side, and the individual one is going to be at the bottom, of course. And then we got the paper pieced triangles. That's what we just finished. It fits in right there. And then all the pieces, all the block finishing pieces. We got the sashings for around that big block. And along the sides. One lonely little square for the corner, and then 2 bigger sashes next to those accent strips. All right, if you've been watching the first 3 months, this is going to seem very familiar to you. So let's go through it again. We're going to start with that big center block, and we're going to do the sashing. The sides, then the top. We're pressing away from that big block, so out and then up and down. Switch over to the right side of the top part. Put the background next to the Drunkard's Path accent strip. Press towards that background. Top part is done except for that seam, so do that seam and then of course press towards that big block. Top part is done. Let's move to the bottom. We're way bottom, we're going to put the two backgrounds on either side of that Drunkard's Path down here. Press out towards that background pieces and then attach that row to the triangle paper piecing. Press down towards the bottom of the block. Top half is done. Bottom rows are finished. Just attaching those two and that seam right there. Once that seam is done, you're going to be pressing up towards the bigger half of the block, and just like that, your block will be finished. So let me take this to the sewing machine and I'll see you at the end. Alright, there we go. Month number 4. Fun 9 patches, half squares, Drunkard's Path, and triangle squares. Lots of fun, right? Give this puppy a good best press or a starch to make sure all those bulky corners stay nice and flat. Let me just give her a turn over so you can see the back. There we go. Thanks again for joining me on my scrappy journey of the Illusions Block of the Month sampler. If you haven't checked out the first 3 months, check them out. I'll put them in the comments below. And please hit that subscribe button so that you can see how I do with the rest of the month and see how this puppy turns out at the end of the year. If you like what you saw, please share with friends. Hit the old thumbs up. And I'll see you next time. Back to my quilt lab. Bye-bye, everyone.